What's up everyone and welcome to our 11th deck building competition. As always, viewers were the ones that voted for what topic they wanted to brew around, and the one that won was multicolored commanders that are built as monocolored decks. We ended up receiving over 265 submissions and the creativity was off the charts. Actually surprised in terms of colors. I don't know why it was so surprising to me, but mono red was the most selected color with 24% of the decks, then mono blue at 21%, then there was white, black, and green, and then colorless as well. So yeah, I guess I just don't always see mono red as the most popular monocolor option, but I think when it's on a multicolor commander who helps to kind of get over the draw deficit that a lot of red decks face, then a lot of people were really excited to jump into like mono red with their commander who could help them draw. And kind of like a random commentary, but it seemed like a lot more decks in this competition specifically were using Architect than like ever before. I feel like it's usually Moxfield, but there were so many more Architect entries than previous competitions, at least from what I felt. I only noticed that because the loading times sometimes were longer for Architect, so I did notice that. But yeah, really interesting. I guess people really like that site. But all right, jumping into the actual decks, the reason why we came here, we're going to start with the honorable mentions. And the first one was there was a Baelith Baradol Entertainer deck, which had the background of Clancrafter. And instead of focusing on Baelith's mono red, they went with mono blue. And it focused, instead of making the commander huge, it instead tried to make all of the opponent's creatures tiny. So it played a lot of humility effects that made their entire board 1/1s with no abilities. And then their opponents had to swing with those 1/1s with no abilities and just go out to die. There was a Ramos Dragon Engine deck that was mono green Hydras. And I thought that this was actually a really cool take on Ramos because normally people play with a lot of multicolor spells to try and maximize the number of counters per spell that's cast. But instead, they just went with mono green because mono green has so many ways to double up or increase the number of counters that are put on the commander for every one green spell that's cast. And then it can remove those counters from Ramos, have a ton of mana to dump into Hydras and get discounted Hydras. And so that was a really cool build to see how that worked. There was a Sunspider Nimble Weber deck, which focused on getting the Aether Spark and used proliferate effects for the Aether Spark and a few other planeswalkers. And it also won with Infect, with all of that proliferating and Radstorm, things like that. And kind of sticking along with that Super Friends side of things, there was a Mila Crafty Companion deck that focused on winning with near-death experience. So it paid life, it had a lot of cards that you could lose life, and it ran other things like you can't lose the game effects or maybe life switch effects. Since you're trying to get your life low, you could switch with your opponents. And since Gideon is in the art of near-death experience, they decided to go all in and make a Gideon Planeswalker tribal deck. And I just saw so many cards that I have never seen before and a lot of others that I haven't seen in years. It kind of felt like a deck that I would have played up against in like 2011 with my Asperia the Inscrutable deck, which was just jammed together with my favorite flyers. That was a terrible deck, but it was kind of, before the idea of synergy took over like all these conversations. Not to say that this deck is bad at all. Just seeing all of those old cards gave that same feel as EDH in 2011. There was a Lagomos Hand of Hatred deck that could tutor for hostility and play cards like Bolt Wave and other high damage across all opponents' effects, and then turn all of that damage into 3/1s to either one-shot someone or possibly one-shot the entire board out of nowhere. I also enjoyed reading through a Phaenax God of Deception colorless deck that wasn't exclusively focused on Eldrazi. It did have one or two, but I did notice Eldrazi were a super common win condition in this deck. And so when people were kind of stripped of their typical ways of winning with a commander, I did notice more commonly in this deck competition than in others, people relied on colorless or Eldrazi to swing and win that way. But anyways, this one won with like Millennium Calendar. It had a lot of untappers and just milling out opponents in general, or good old combat with huge colorless creatures that are not the Titans. And lastly, there was a Ruka Biologist Mono Black deck with the goal of flipping Throne of the Grim Captain. They mentioned that there are 3 black merfolk that are all really bad. So in order to get the Grim Captain without defaulting to changelings, they used Ruka to turn slivers into merfolk that could then be crafted into Grim Captain with other creatures like dinosaurs, which are crafted from the graveyard due to like swamp cycling. And so I think crafting in general is a really underrated ability, and it is cool to see the workaround of turning the slivers into merfolk to then get this really cool flip card that I think most people don't build around, because that is such a high task or high requirement to flip and get the Grim Captain on the board. There were just so many more decks that I wish I could highlight. There were actually 59 decks that I highlighted as potential honorable mentions. I wish I could shout them all out. You know, there was some really cool Zakama mono white deck. There's Una Grand Summoner as kind of mono green aristocrats. I see you with the Sivris PDH untap green deck. You know, there's just so many cool things that I wish I could give everyone their flowers that they deserve. But with the nature of this, you know, 265 decks, I wish I could just message everyone personally and say how much I love their decks. But thank you so much for being here, and I appreciate everyone who did take the time to submit a deck. All of the deck lists for the honorable mentions and the finalists will be available in the description below. And then if you are enjoying all of these decks, I do have the 260 plus available for patrons. This time I did try something different. Instead of just having the spreadsheet, I built like a new viewing experience that you can download as an HTML file and browse locally in your browser. And you can filter it by colors, you know, you can do searches. And for decks you like, you can click on the link provided to see the actual deck list online. If you do like this approach of, instead of reading through a spreadsheet, kind of having this HTML experience, let me know, because yeah, I can continue to do that for future competitions. But yes, that's available for patrons in the description below if you want to check that out. But jumping into our finalists, our first deck today is a 3-Dog Galaxy News DJ. I am not familiar with Fallout, and also the set itself I wasn't really familiar with due to just like the exclusivity of collector boosters when it released. So when I read that name, I honestly thought it was an Unfinity commander. But no, 3-Dog is commander legal, and it is a 3-mana 1/5 that says, whenever you attack, you may pay 2 and sacrifice an aura attached to 3-Dog Galaxy News DJ. When you sacrifice an aura this way, for each other attacking creature you control, create a token that's a copy of that aura attached to that creature. So really cool ability. I'd never seen this before. The builder decided to go with mono white build, but what I liked is that they went with a different approach from most other decks that I kind of checked online. A lot of decks build around powerful auras. You know, you see this and you're like, oh man, can you imagine if I had like an All That Glitters and then I make a ton of copies of All That Glitters and then it just keeps growing and I have a massive powerful army that just one-shots the board. You know, or you can start thinking about, oh, what if I had 20 copies of this insanely busted aura? I think the issue with going super powerful enchantments that way is that once an opponent sees like an All That Glitters on your commander or some other super strong aura on 3-Dog, that becomes a huge threat because it's just a ticking time bomb. They're like, oh, great, yeah, you're going to make 25 copies. Might as well just remove you right now. But what I liked is that this deck focuses on going wide with lifelink creatures in particular, and it only has 2 auras in the entire deck. There's Squire's Devotion, which seems like a pretty harmless inclusion in comparison to what it could be. And then the main one is Pharaoh's Mantle. The updated text of Pharaoh's Mantle says, whenever enchanted creature attacks and isn't blocked, its controller may have it deal damage equal to its power +2 to another target creature. If that player does, the attacking creature assigns no combat damage this turn. Honestly, when you read that, it kind of sounds underwhelming. It seems kind of like Draft Chaff, a card from that should have been forgotten in 1994 when it was released in Fallen Empires. But that's why I love this. The fact that someone can take one of their pet cards and make a deck around it. The goal of this deck is to assemble a big board of lifelink tokens, enchant them with this pet card, Feral's Mantle, remove problematic creatures, and probably just the entire board. And unless maybe you politic, you just gain an obscene amount of life for attacking and creating a lot of copies of this. So in terms of categories in this deck, the first is token makers, and there's a lot, so I won't go into them all. And as I mentioned, the goal is to get a lot with lifelink. So some of those in particular, there's like Charismatic Conqueror, which gives people the choice of either giving you a creature or tapping their creature or artifact when it enters. So with Mana Rocks, you're likely getting that creature. There's Cub Warden, which creates 2 lifelink tokens when it mutates. Leonin War Leader does the same, but when it attacks. Summon Good King Mog the 12th can create a ton of Moogles with lifelink across the 4 turns that it sticks around, and same with Moogle's Valor. Then there's several other artifacts and enchantments as well that can make lifelink creatures. And there's a lot more that make tokens that don't have lifelink, but that's kind of the big part of the plan, so that's why I mentioned these ones. And since there's only 2 auras that we're trying to get, there's several tutors that we can run, like Lighten Tutor, 3 Dreams, Open the Armory. And then ideally, we can get Squire's Devotion on 3 Dog first. Then we copy it, we create a bunch of 1/1 vampires with lifelink. For every copy we create, which is hopefully a lot since we're focused on going wide. And as those enchantments enter, there's constellation effects that are triggering. So like Archon of Sun's Grace is creating 2/2s. There's Eidolon of Astral Winds, which buffs up creatures to be 4/4s with flying. There's Ghostly Dancers, which makes 3/1s with flying. And Optimistic Scavenger is also buffing up those creatures. And once there is that wide board, we can copy Feral's Mantle onto each of those attacking creatures. And instead of just dealing damage to opponents, they can deal their power +2 to any creature. So with the constellation effects, like making them 4/4, that's 6 damage per creature, which should be enough to clean the board and gain a ton of life. And like I said, you can politic, be like, okay, I won't remove this creature. I'll just do this instead. But yeah, with that life gain, Alenda's Hierophant is getting stronger. There's also the Gaffer, which is drawing cards. And the deck runs a lot of recursion in case your enchantments go to the graveyard. And there's a lot more non-aura enchantments that are putting in work as well. I just thought that this deck was super unique. It was built around a card that I'd never heard of before. And, I've read through that entire set and it didn't stick out to me. And so I love just being able to see when people can make strategies around cards that they love, regardless of how popular or unpopular it is. So great job with the brew. I loved reading through that. Next up is a deck that is led by Inniaz the Gale Force, who is an Azorius commander, but this deck built it as mono blue for the competition. Inniaz can absolutely just mess with people's game plans, depending on just how savage you want to be. Inniaz is a 5 mana 4/4 that costs 3 generic and 2 blue. It has flying and has an activated ability that costs 2 generic and a hybrid blue or white. And that just gives attacking creatures with flying +1/+1 until end of turn. And then Inniaz says, whenever 3 or more creatures you control with flying attack, each player gains control of a non-land permanent of your choice controlled by the player to their right. So as I mentioned, that ability can just absolutely destroy a ton of decks by itself if you just want to swap around people's commanders, because there's so many decks that are built around having the commander in play that if you swap it around, their deck crumbles or they have to use their own removal on their commander. I'm not saying that this deck does that, but I'm saying, you can be as mean as or generous or politicky as you want with Inniaz, especially because it evades hexproof. It doesn't say target, so you can steal or trade people's hexproof or shrouded Voltron commanders because it bypasses that protection. This deck in particular is focused on having flyers with ETB effects and then exchanging control of those creatures and permanents outside of just your commander's ability. And then you can, blink those creatures that you own but don't control, and then bring them back under your control to get the ETB effect again. So there's several things that can do that, but Meneldor Swift Savior is listed as the secret commander due to having that blink ability tacked on. So in terms of like ETB effects, it's pretty small. It's low to the ground. There's simple cards like Augury Owl, Fairy Seer, and Silver Raven. All of those scry when you enter, or when it enters. There's Frost Trickster, which can tap down potential blockers. Mole Drifter, Sky Scanner, and Cloudkin Seer all draw cards when they enter. And then there's things like Cloud of Fairies and Peregrine Drake, which can ramp. Agent of Treachery can steal your opponent's creatures permanently, or Kitesail Larcenist can turn threats into treasures with no abilities. And although he doesn't have like an ETB effect himself, Donald Herald of Wings can just, double up on the first creature with flying that you cast each turn. So we have a lot of flying, low to the ground creatures with nice ETBs that you can recur. There's ETB doublers like, of course, Panharmonicon. There's Virtue of Knowledge. And then there's a bunch of blink spells. There's those effects on a stick. So I mentioned Meneldor as the secret commander. Another great one is Identity Thief, which is actually a really cool ability. It exiles a non-token creature when it attacks until the end step, and then it becomes a copy of the creature that you exiled. So if you exile one of your own creatures that you just traded, then it will come back under your control, and then you'll get that ETB effect again. And then there's also like classics like Planar Incision to blink your creature owned by someone else to bring it back under your own control. Outside of the commander switch up ability, this deck also runs several donation cards or switch cards. So Shifting Grift is a personal favorite that can hit creatures, artifacts, or also enchantments. So maybe you want to switch around Illusions of Grandeur, which is in this deck, which gives you 20 life when it enters, and then it deals 20 life when it leaves the battlefield. So you just let it enter, you gain 20 life, you switch it around with an opponent, and then when that leaves, they take 20 life. There's Puka's Mischief, which lets you switch up non-land permanents with someone else in your upkeep, but it has to be less mana value. I think Sudden Substitution is such a fun spell. You can replace one of your small creatures with a non-creature spell, and it has Split Second, which is just incredible. There's Ledger Domain, which can switch up artifacts or creatures. Modify Memory is one I've talked about before. You can trade creatures, or if you don't own them, you draw 3 cards and switch it up. And Perplexing Chimera is always just fun on the board, kind of create some chaos. People never know when they're going to exchange it, the creature with a spell, so they have to be careful. I think that this is a rather straightforward game plan that can play out a lot better and stronger than it looks with just a list, because so much of the game plan is focused on stealing other people's creatures or being strategic with what creatures you do switch around. So I think with theft or switch up decks like that, it's important that you're not always the one that owns the strongest creatures on the battlefield. Because if you're the one annoying everyone else by messing up their plans, and then you're also having the strongest creatures on the board, then you're the threat as well. You're the annoying guy and you're the threat. But I do think there is a lot of potential for politicking. There's a lot of potential for making deals, and also making sure that you're not the public enemy. So you're kind of working together to take down the strongest people. You can gift the biggest threat to another opponent. And so I think that you did a really good job with this deck, and I love the idea of switching or giving creatures that you own to another player and then blinking them to get them back for you. Great job. There's 2 more finalists, but first, as a quick plug, I did want to mention I started a new Patreon tier this week where I select 10 unpopular cards and a bonus card worth like at least $5 every month, and I send it to patrons. I include like a page description of why I chose each card and what I like about the card, and I also share like some recommendations of maybe some commanders or decks that you could include them in. I actually shipped out my first ones this past week. I had a ton of fun doing it, and I'm shipping out to new patrons again this week, and we'll continue to do this every week and every month. I've been having so much fun selecting the cards and putting a lot of thoughts and reasoning as to why I think that you should be playing these hidden gems in your decks. It's like the price of a collector booster, but you get all of those other benefits, like seeing these deck lists. You get access to like the bonus videos and also a deck review each month where I'll share unpopular card recommendations for one of your decks. Either way, I just do this all on the side. So I appreciate any support you are willing to give, but whether you are a patron or not, thanks so much for being here. I do appreciate you all. But jumping back to the actual decks, the next one is Ajani Nakatul Pariah, which is normally a Boros commander, but they decided to build this as mono red Ajani. So Ajani is a 2-mana 1/2 cat warrior that says, when Ajani enters, create a 2/1 white cat warrior creature token. Whenever one or more cats you control die, you may exile Ajani, then return him to the battlefield transformed under his owner's control. When he's transformed, he is a planeswalker that has a +2 ability that says, put a +1/+1 counter on each cat you control. There's a 0 that says, create a 2/1 white cat warrior creature token. When you do, if you control a red permanent other than Ajani, he deals damage equal to the number of creatures you control to any target. And then the -4 says, each opponent chooses an artifact, a creature, an enchantment, and a planeswalker from among the non-land permanents they control, then sacrifices the rest. So when I saw this commander choice, I assumed that they were just going to go mono white because, the cat support. But instead, this is a mono red goblin deck. It kind of sounds like a random non-synergistic pick, but it actually makes much more sense than I had initially thought when I saw the commander and the choice. They actually use the commander as a win condition by providing something that most mono red decks don't have access to, which is a one-sided board wipe. So instead of getting wiped out too with a blasphemous act, or even in the more true one-sided scenarios that mono red does have, so things like Call Forth the Tempest, that can still leave big or indestructible threats around. But with Ajani's ultimate, it only hits your opponents and it makes them sacrifice. So it bypasses or kind of evades indestructibility, and they have to sacrifice all their creatures but one, maybe two if they have an artifact creature or enchantment creature lying around. But either way, that clears their boards and leaves them open to a full-on goblin board state ready to be attacked. Despite, being centered around goblins, it still does run 8 changelings and a few cats, so you can dependably flip your commander in case the one of the cats that Ajani does create when it enters does get exiled. I think there's a few nice things about that. One is with changelings, they benefit from 2 different anthems. There are a lot of goblins that buff up other goblins, and then also Ajani's plus ability buffs them up for being cats. So creatures like Bloodline Pretender and Tarian Mauler can become really big threats with the 2 anthems that are just hanging out. In terms of the goblins themselves, it was similar to a lot of other goblin tribal decks. We got Krankle Mob Boss, of course. There's Muxus Goblin Grandee. We got the Goblin War Chief. One of my personal favorites is House Squad Heavy from Aetherdrift. That price is just going up and up. And there's also Goblin Goliath, who has an activated ability that costs 4 and a tap that says, if a source you control would deal damage to an opponent this turn, it deals double that damage to that player instead. So with the amount of goblins that you can get on the board, it's honestly not unrealistic to say that Ajani's 0 ability of dealing damage to any target equal to the number of creatures you control could realistically one-shot an opponent in the mid or late game. And the same applies to Goblin Warstrike, which, if you can activate Goblin Goliath, can deal a lot of damage. The deck has a lot of cards that have additional costs of sacrificing creatures. So things like Infernal Plunge for mana, there's Betrayer's Bargain, Collateral Damage, and Fiery Conclusion for damage. And then there's things like Skull Clamp and Goblin Bombardment. And the reason why we want to be sacrificing our creatures is that so we can reliably sacrifice changelings or also the cats in order to flip Ajani. Then once he actually is flipped into a planeswalker, you have enough creatures on the board that you can block him for him, and then you run enough removal to hopefully get rid of flyers. Ideally with this, you can do the plus ability once, and then when you want, you can take down Ajani with his ultimate ability, which should bring each of your opponents down to 1, maybe 2 creatures, like I said, depending if they have like a artifact creature on the board. But that is enough to do a lot of damage with a super wide goblin board and some anthems lying around. They did mention that this was their first take on a goblin deck, but they had a really fun time doing it. So if you are a goblin enjoyer, I would definitely recommend checking out this deck because it was a very viable and a super fun take on a mono red goblin deck that you don't see every day. And so great job with the build. I had a lot of fun reading it and excited to hear what people think about this deck. Our last finalist of the day is Nael Avizoa Aeronaut, which is by far the most unpopular commander here. It is, I think, in the bottom 5 of least played Simic commanders in the game. Nael is a 4-mana 2/4 with flying. It has domain, and it says, whenever Nael Avizoa Aeronaut deals combat damage to a player, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control. Put up to 1 of them on top of your library and the rest on the bottom in a random order. Then if there are 5 basic land types among lands you control, draw a card. So this is a mono green build that is focusing on getting all 5 basic land types despite the monocolor restriction. So with those 5 basic land types, this is a Sunburst / Converge / Domain deck. So it focuses on getting benefits for each color among colors spent to cast spells. So like I said, while this is mono green, it plays a ton of colorless creatures, and thus it kind of leans into colorless specific spells and board wipes because there's just so many large colorless creatures that this deck is playing. So in terms of like categories for this, the first is, of course, since we're building around domain, there's a lot of cards that help us to increase the basic land count. There's Dryad of the Elysian Grove, Nylea's Presence, Overlord of the Hauntwoods, and Prismatic Omen. So each of those can give us all 5 at once in terms of basic lands. There's a lot of lands as well that can be different basic land types, and several others that can grant maybe 2 or 3 at a time. And so even though you are mono green, you can get all 5 pretty easily, honestly. But the actual meat and the focus of this deck is there are 3 types of cards that benefit from having 5 basic land types. There's Sunburst, there's Converge, and Domain. So when I mention these cards, kind of think about it with the assumption that Domain is online and that we have 5 basic land types. So the first, there's Sunburst. Etched Oracle can enter with 4+1/+1 counters. I don't say 5 because it costs 4, and so maximum you can have 4 color of mana that was spent to cast it, and then you can pay 1 to remove those +1/+1 counters to draw 3 cards. There's Arcbound Wanderer, which has modular, so when it dies, it can pass along its counters to another artifact creature. Solar Array and Lux Artillery can give artifact creatures Sunburst, and if you have over 30 counters across your board, then you deal 10 damage to each opponent in your end step with Lux Artillery. There's also Pentad Prism and Crystalline Crawler, which can add mana by removing counters from them, which they gained from Sunburst. In terms of Converge, which is like, there was a lot of new support released in Secrets of Strixhaven. There's Transcendent Archaic, which enters, you can draw 5 cards, then discard 2. There's Together as One, which lets you draw 5 cards, deal 5 damage, and gain 5 life from casting it with those basic land types. There's Wild Growth Archaic. I think that this one is insane because it keeps getting bigger as a 2-drop every time you spend different colors of mana on other creatures. There's Domain as well, which I feel like is just an ability I've never looked at because I never thought of including Domain in any of my decks. Briar Hydra gets 5 counters on it every time it deals combat damage to a player. That's pretty strong. Prismatic Geoscope can add 5 mana every time it taps. And Trump the Domains can give +5/+5 and trample to your creatures. I mentioned 3 groups, but there is one other that is colorless creatures that cost less for the number of basic land types you control. So Draco is a 16 drop that can become a 6 drop and is a 9/9 with flying. There's also Stratodon, which becomes a 5 mana for a 5/5 with trample. But like I said, there are a lot of cards that can give it Sunburst, so it can enter with even more +1/+1 counters on it. And then once you have all of these cards that are benefiting from the colors of spells used to cast it, you can hit with Nael to selectively refill your hand. Great card draw and good card selection. And then there's a bunch of colorless creatures and synergy. There's multicolor spell punishment and also counter synergies. So I mentioned a ton of colorless synergies like Echoes of Eternity. It goes crazy with the number of colorless spells that are run in the deck. This also runs Forsaken Monument and Liberator, Urza's Battlethopter. It runs All Is Dust and several others like Omarthus Ghostfire Initiate, which can get huge. There are a lot more of the strong colorless spells, so if this deck is interesting to you, definitely check it out because I'm not doing it justice with all of the colorless cards that I am leaving out. But like I said, I've always skipped over Domain, Sunburst, Converge, because in my mind, I didn't want to run these in 5-color decks. But I love how you showcase what can be done with 5 colors in a monocolor build. And there's just so many more things than I'd ever imagined in terms of card support for this. So excellent brew, had a fun time reading through this. But yeah, that's everything that I had for this deck building competition. I will open up the poll tomorrow so that I don't spoil it for anyone who's not able to watch this right when it comes out. But vote on your favorite, which one did you enjoy the most, and then the winner will receive either their choice of a Lorwyn Eclipsed or a Secrets of Strixhaven Collector Booster Pack. For anyone who is interested in participating, we will have a new competition coming out, so I will poll the community and ask questions to see what they want the next deck building competition to be on. But in the meantime, all of the deck lists for the honorable mentions and the finalists are in the description below, as well as the 270 others are in the Patreon if you want to check that out in the description. But thank you so much to everyone who did participate, submitting decks. It's always so much fun to read through them and see your creativity. If you like this, share this with a friend, and hopefully we'll see you in the next one.